Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our final talk of the day. And it's an honor to be introducing our next speaker, who really needs very little introduction. Alys Tomlinson was born in Brighton and studied photography at Central St. Martin's. Her recent projects, Ex Voto and Lost Summer, have been exhibited internationally and published as books. She is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Taylor Wessing Photographic Portrait Prize, which she won in 2020, and the Sony World Photographer of the Year, which in 2018, for which she was the overall winner. Work from her recent series, Li Isolani, is featured in this year's IPE, using analog film with a large format plate camera. Over the years, Tomlinson documented the traditional masks and costumes worn during festivals and celebrations on islands of the Venetian Lagoon, Sicily, and Sardinia. Thank you, Alys.
Oh, thank you very much. So yes, thanks for the introduction, Freddie. So as mentioned, today I'm really going to focus on my latest long-term personal project, which is called L'Isolani. So if there's any Italian speakers out there, apologies for the pronunciation. I am learning and taking lessons at the moment. But this is a project that's actually been brewing, I suppose, for a really long time. A lot of my projects come from influences other than photography. Of course, I'm very inspired by photographers, but I often also take inspiration from literature, from poetry, from films. For instance, Ex Voto, my other big series, was directly influenced by a film that I saw. And this project was something that had been, kind of percolating in my mind for quite a few years. And the reason this project came about, and L'Isolani means the islanders in Italian, is that particularly in my 20s, I was often commissioned by Time Out. So Time Out was one of my kind of main clients, and I was really working mainly commercially at that point. And for these travel guide commissions I would get, they were incredibly kind of exciting for me, because it really opened my eyes to, of course, different cities and different cultures. I was sent all over the place, mainly in North America and Europe. And I would have this enormous list that I had to work through. So it was kind of, I had to do photographs of the classic sites, but also bars and restaurants and clubs and trips out of town as well. And I kind of look back on those years and I wonder what I learned from them. But really what I learned was to be very resourceful and to be a kind of problem solver and to be very resilient. And I think some of those kind of skills, I guess, have been carried perhaps into my personal projects. But the reason this whole project started was that years ago, I was sent and I had to do the pictures around Venice. So this is a picture of Venice, as you can see, for the city guide. So I was sent to all the classic Venetian sites, but I was also on my list was an island called San Michele, which you can see here, which is actually an island, a cemetery island. And this image really stayed with me, because I remember I was getting the vaporetto, which is the boat, across to the island. And there was all these Venetians standing, waiting. It was almost like the equivalent of a bus stop, the vaporetto stop. And they were standing there dressed fairly kind of mournfully, I suppose, but quite very smartly, in a very kind of dignified presence. And they were clutching these bunches of flowers to take the vaporetto over to San Michele to put them at the graves of their loved ones. And there was a very kind of low mist on the lagoon, so it was incredibly atmospheric. And that image really stayed with me. And it led me to think about making work about mourning and about the process of mourning and continuing to visit this island. And I kind of had this idea, first of all, so I would revisit this island over time. And I soon realized that this project wasn't really going to work, partly because I didn't really speak Italian. There were very kind of officious workers who worked at the cemetery, so it's publicly run, but it's also kind of governed by the local authorities who were not keen on you taking photographs. But I also really started to question my own intention and integrity, like what gives me the rights to photograph people in this state of grief and vulnerability, especially as I don't share the language or the culture. So I soon realized that wasn't going to work. But also, obviously, Venice has been, I kind of wanted to stay in Venice, but Venice has been photographed endlessly and endlessly. It's obviously incredibly beautiful and evocative in many ways. But as a result, a lot of Venetians are very kind of suspicious of photographers. So I really started questioning where this work was going. I then started looking at literature and poetry, and I started researching this idea of what it means to be an islander. And it's strange because up until this point, I hadn't really kind of considered myself an islander. I mean, I am born in the UK. I was born in Brighton, so of course I am, but I didn't feel it was really a strong part of my identity. But I began to embark on this research, and I came across this book in particular by Calvino, which is Italian folk tales. And I started reading about the history of islands, so not just the islands in the Venetian lagoon, but I came very interested in the islands to the south and to the west, particularly Sicily and Sardinia. And this book, I would say, was very influential in terms of my research and the kind of direction the project took, because I then became interested in these notions of what makes us who we are, these notions of cultures and ideas all coming together, particularly through carnival and festivals and fables and folk tales. And actually what happened was the work kind of I began to get some kind of rhythm in terms of the research. And this led to a publication that was part of an award called the Prix Alys, which is a quite prestigious kind of competition run in Switzerland, where they actually shortlisted 8 photographers, 8 artists. And we were given a little bit of money to work towards a new project. So I proposed this project, Lys Solani, although I didn't really know fully where it was going at this point. And the idea of this publication is that it gives you a real insight into the process and the research behind photographers' projects. So I feel with photography, you very often see a finished, polished project, but you never really understand how that photographer got there. And through my experience, certainly a lot of the work I do is disappointing at times, it's frustrating at times. A lot of the projects don't work out as you expect or hope them to. So in a sense, it gives you this real entry into the mind of the photographer. And for this book, I decided to show, so this is actually spreads from the book, pages of my own kind of sketchbooks and notebooks. So at this point, I was identifying islands in the Venetian lagoon I might want to photograph, but I was also looking at poetry and literature that had been written that referred to a lot of the time, yes, these kind of exciting events and festivities and carnivals that really all went towards making up this idea of what an islander is, and also this sense of strong identity and actually pride that is really prevalent on these islands that I began to understand. So initially I started going to some of the islands in the Venetian lagoon, and as I said, this then carried down to the south and the west of Italy. And as you can see, I was researching poetry like everyone from Siegfried Sassoon to Colin Toybin. So really looking at writers who'd looked at ritual, who'd looked at tradition, and who'd also documented festivities in Italy. And it was at this point that I began to discover these amazing kind of rituals and carnivals and celebrations that happen often annually in many of these often very small kind of villages and communities within the Italian islands of Sicily and Sardinia. And my initial idea was to go when the actual carnivals were on and photograph people taking part in these events. And I should also say that my work at this point and continues to be shot on a very kind of cumbersome, old-fashioned style, large format camera. So this gives my work a kind of stillness, and it makes you be very precise with how you work. It makes you concentrate. It makes you really, really slow down as well. So often my projects, I think, the theme of my projects is reflected in the way I'm working with that camera as well, which forces you to be thoughtful and contemplative. And actually, in many ways, there's a kind of rhythm to working that's quite meditative. So I decided that my idea was that I would photograph these festivities and carnivals using the old-fashioned large format camera. The problem was that COVID came along, and of course, all the festivals and the carnivals were cancelled. So I wasn't able to go and meet people and photograph them. So I did end up going, as you can see, but actually what happened was that I decided through my research, I had identified groups and communities that I really wanted to photograph. And I was very interested in trying to explore this kind of hinterland between reality and fiction, because as you'll see when we look at some of the images, and 4 of these images are are upstairs in the exhibition. There's this kind of tension, I find, between modernity and tradition, and actually moving from the islands of the Venetian lagoon to the south and west of Italy. The islands are much kind of wilder and untamed. So the islands of Sicily and Sardinia offer this amazing landscape, this quite dramatic landscape. So actually, for the first time, I decided to try and work with a fixer. And this is me, this is Giovanna, who became my fixer. And this is the first time I've ever worked with a fixer on a photography project. So normally it's kind of me and my camera sitting around for hours, seeing if an interesting, for instance, pilgrim is going to appear in Lourdes. And this, which doesn't always happen, but sometimes it does. But for this project, I actually worked very closely with a fixer. And this woman called Giovanna is actually a documentary film producer. And she was recommended to me by a friend. And we actually, through my research and through her research and through us getting together, we worked in a different way this time, which was that everything was set up in advance. So Giovanna is a wonderful mix of kind of persuasiveness and charm. And once I'd identified the communities I really wanted to visit, she would get in touch with them. And we would actually meet the locals within these communities, and they would come either completely dressed up already in the outfits that they would have worn to the festivals, or we would be with them while they were getting dressed, which was a kind of ritual in itself. So working in this way meant that I actually had much more control over the subjects, if you like, and the people I was photographing. And also you can see from this photograph, I can only use that camera on quite a big tripod. It has to be completely set up in advance. I have to do a light meter reading. It's a very considered and slow way of working. It can't be rushed. So it forces you to really think about what you're doing. And I find think about your subjects as well in a different way. And what was really wonderful was that actually a lot of the local villagers were incredibly excited about the idea of getting dressed up in these outfits and these costumes, because they hadn't been able to put them on for 2 years and because of COVID. And you have to understand that these costumes they're absolutely kind of treasured by the community. So they're often kept in these almost kind of hidden vaults, and they're treated with a huge amount of kind of pride and respect. So obviously, from my point of view, it was an incredible privilege for them to kind of dress up, if you like, in these outfits for the purpose of me photographing them. But they seemed to really, I felt, understood what I was trying to say, although in a way I wasn't quite sure what I was trying to say, but also I was clear that there was something really compelling about the way that these traditions still existed in the modern day. And this again is some spreads from the Pre-Alys book, the book that showed the process of the projects. And these are some early contact sheets. So as you can see from a contact sheet, you end up with, these are all shot on 5:4 film, so you end up with the images kind of laid out like that. So it's quite easy to start making decisions about what works and what doesn't. But what I was really kind of interested in was this sense of tradition being so firmly embedded in the people and the landscapes, but also the sense that the young people were beginning to move through the villages. So obviously a lot of concern there is over whether these traditions are going to continue to be upheld. And many of these communities are tiny, tiny communities where everybody knows each other. It became an event, actually, us going. So I would turn up with Giovanna and half the village would kind of pile out with wine and cakes. And I mean, it was really, really lovely. But they took such enormous pride in putting on these outfits and kind of showing them to us. And then, in a way, embodying these kind of spirits of the past, that it ended up being an incredible kind of experience for me as a photographer. And I think what really happened was that when I was doing my research, I found this quote, which is on the right, which I actually read had been inscripted on a bell in Sicily, on an old church bell tower. And it said, "I cast out demons, I calm the storms, I call to the living, I cry for the dead." And when I read that, I thought, wow, this is somehow what I'm trying to say about this sense of good and evil and the sacred and the profane, and the kind of relationship with the land and the relationship with the past. And that became almost for me a kind of guide throughout the work. And I do often find very much when I'm working on these long-term projects that I need something in my head that kind of bolsters me to keep going. And for me, that quote provided me with what I needed to continue with this project and really think there might be kind of something there. And as you can see on the left, the costumes, it's what I found particularly interesting about many of these costumes is that they don't always have a kind of solid origin. So there are many different themes and elements coming together. And for instance, on the top left, you've got two quite kind of sinister looking young women. And this actually happens on Good Friday during Holy Week, during Settimana Santa in Italy, where young women are kind of paraded through the village, really, dressed, as you can see, in black head to toe, holding up the crucifix like this with a crown of thorns. And it's supposed to represent them repenting for their sins, and their identities are not known to anybody. Although I always think, oh, surely their nonna, their grandma's going to recognise the shoes or something, but apparently they don't. So, and lots of these traditions are things that I would say I don't kind of agree with or necessarily think are good in terms of, you know, representing women. That is not something I would think is a particularly progressive way for women to be represented. But there was this really interesting mix for me of the kind of element of faith and sin and redemption, but also very much this relationship with the land, which was extremely strong in many of these communities. What was also kind of difficult for me, in a sense, making this work, was that these festivals have been documented widely and endlessly, actually, by a lot of photographers in the past. And I always think with photography, you're never going to be the first person to ever document this. You may think you found the, you know, the most elusive tribe on the planet, and no doubt someone will have been there beforehand. And I always try to say this to students: you're not going to be the first, but it's about doing it in your way. And for me, I get very kind of embedded in the work and invested in the work. And whenever I take a photograph, whether it's of, you know, a kind of woman with antlers or a local with cattle bells, or it's of the pilgrims I photograph for Ex Voto, I very much find that there's always kind of part of me somewhere in that picture. And it's really important for me that that is not conveyed in a way that viewers or the audience would necessarily see, but that I know I feel something when I look at those pictures. If I feel something and I feel almost a part of me being there, then that for me is what makes it a strong image. But I discovered that many of these traditions and rituals as well, as you can see, particularly from the top left and the bottom two, are to do with the, for instance, the cycles of the season. So many of them have kind of pagan foundations as well. They're wrapped up in folklore and fables. And there's a lot about this kind of tension between man or woman as well and the land and the fertility of the seasons. So as I said, there are many different origins, and it's very difficult to pinpoint exactly where they all came from, but they all come together, I think, to kind of, in some ways, tell us something about the human condition. Most of the images, as you can see, are portraits kind of taken within the crumbling stone or the dramatic rocks, but there is also, actually, this is the only interior shot, and this was taken in Venice in an old church. And I suppose I've always found the idea of the confessional like fascinating in terms of what it represents. And this image kind of took me back to my time in San Michele, the cemetery island. For me, a confessional, and I'm not actually, I don't consider myself religious in a formal way at all, but it represents this space that's kind of both private and sacred, that speaks of revelations, that speaks of secrets, that's intimate and it's revealing. And I suppose I'm really always interested in these kind of stories that are untold. There's something of them that still remains, and you can't quite figure out what it is or where it came from. And this image just makes me think, you know, of makes us ask questions about people's kind of disclosure on what we represent and who we all are, and you're kind of wondering what happened behind that curtain. So it's interesting for me if an image can somehow capture some of the stillness, but some of our kind of own inner world as well. And that's really important for me, again, that the images are them, in a sense, they're not just portraits. There's something there that really allows you to understand in some way something about that person, whether it's about their faith or their beliefs or their rituals. So this became quite an important image for me as the project progressed. I haven't got time anyway, so I'm just wondering, I've lost track, sorry. 10 minutes. 10 minutes, yeah. Okay, thank you. So as with any project, I end up with kind of favourites, I suppose. And it's funny because sometimes these favourites are an image that I see on the contact sheet that just stands out. If there's a gesture or there's the timbre of the light or there's something about their pose. But for me, I feel this is one of the kind of strongest and most successful images of the series. And these guys are from they're from Sardinia, and they're called sort of murderers. And they, during the actual festival, they chase these kind of, they're called the bows, these other men kind of dressed as animals through the village, but they're said to represent the kind of farmers' challenges and relationship with the land. And as you can see, they wear these kind of anthropomorphic wooden masks and these white sheepskins, and they carry these sticks. And I think in some ways, and this is something that I feel I found with Ex Voto as well, which was my project about, long-term project about pilgrimage, that I'm always drawn to images that almost feel like you've stepped out of time with them, almost where time has kind of collapsed around the camera. And I like this idea of creating images where you can't exactly place them in history or exactly in time. It's almost like they're from another era. And I very much felt when I was making this work, because I would turn up not really knowing, you know, who I was going to get on that particular day, if you like, or who was I going to be confronted with as I looked on this ground glass. And making this work, it was really reminded me of almost characters we might have met in our dreams or our nightmares or our own imagination, as well as kind of reminding me about fairy tales and stories from my own childhood. But what really struck me most, as I mentioned earlier, is this fact that there is this enormous sense of pride kind of entrenched in these communities. And time again, when I was making the work, I was told like tradition is in our blood. And that was incredibly important to these villagers. So as well as these kind of slightly surreal, sometimes sinister costumes, I also photographed islanders in their traditional costumes, so more kind of formal in some ways. This image was taken at a Albanian-speaking area of Sicily, which is got an extremely strong community. And the town, it's actually Piana degli Albanesi, is on a kind of mountainous plateau, and it's home to the biggest community of the Albrecht, the Italo-Albanians. And of course, with the history of Italy, and particularly the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, and Venice, you have this enormous kind of coming together and collision, if you like, of different cultures who have been and gone over the years. And the Albanian, I had no idea about this community, but the Albanian community in this small part of the island is extremely strong. And what was particularly lovely about some of these costumes, some water, was that many of them have been passed down for generations and generations. So for instance, this young lady, very kind of beautiful and very poised, but that she's wearing the huge silver buckle is actually belonged to her great grandmother. Her grandma, her nonna, helped her dress up in this beautiful kind of intricate velvet. And this sense of, yes, this sense of this passing down, this kind of exchanging of traditions that they really hope will kind of continue in future generations. But of course, that's very questionable with many young people in these communities now leaving for bigger cities. But what struck me, and you can't always tell obviously from the photographs because many of the participants have masks on, is that this pride in these islands really filters down through every generation. So many of the young men I photographed have jobs, many of them are shepherds, they work on the land. Like this young woman, she works in the local village in the bakery, but she is unbelievably kind of proud of where she comes from and her origins. And that was a really strong feeling for me when I was making work. So throughout the series, you have the portraits, but you also have these kind of dramatic and I suppose rugged landscapes that offer kind of breathing spaces really. And in the book that has now been published by Goss, there are over 50 images in the book that really take you from the kind of cobbled villages in the streets to the tops of mountains and kind of back down again. So we tried to establish a rhythm and fluidity to the sequencing. This was quite a funny experience because talking about feeling that you've been somewhere where photographers have been before, this was a very small village called San Fratello in Sicily. And during Easter, these local men from the village, and they're often all parts of the same family as well, dress in these incredibly elaborate helmets with hand decorated and beaded military style jackets. And they have this kind of sinister mask with a cloth tongue kind of hanging down, and then these incredible horse tails hanging from their backs. And apparently during the actual festival, their job is to kind of wreak havoc on the streets. So they're kidnapping people, well, not really kidnapping, but, you know, taking people from the streets, and then they have to buy them drinks. And I haven't actually been to, they've only just started up the celebrations, but I do really want to go. But apparently they're completely chaotic and it's mayhem and people are absolutely hammered on the streets and there's massive bonfires everywhere. So I realise now that actually even if I had gone with the intention of taking these pictures, I would never have been able to do that during the actual festivals and festivities itself. They needed to have this kind of still quality to them. But when I was taking this, so this is what I meant to say, is that the guy, Salvatore, who's on the left-hand side, he said, we just had a photographer here actually yesterday. And of course, when someone says that, you're like, oh God, I've just been on a 3-hour drive through mountainous villages to reach here. And, you had someone here yesterday. So I kind of rolled my eyes a bit and was like, oh, that's typical, slightly annoying, but I'll, get on with it. And I said, oh, who was it? And they said, oh, it was Mario Testino for Vogue. And I was like, oh, for God's sake, you try and do your research, you try and plan it as well as you can. And bloody Mario Testino was there the day before. Anyway, I think his images were very different, so it's fine. So yeah, just kind of wrapping up now. There's many images to the book, and these are some of my favourite ones. As I said, many of the costumes are treated as these incredibly treasured objects that are kind of hidden away in vaults and chests. So when I came there and they began to kind of dress themselves in these outfits, I almost didn't know what was going to appear next. And then these are 2 young men called the Sonajos, and as you can see, they wear huge heavy cattle bells that go all down their backs. Their faces are covered in soot, and they kind of signify the central role of the cattle and the pastoral in their culture, which is still very strong today in terms of their relationship with the land. And actually, when I turned up, there was about 15 of them, and there was this, I wish I'd filmed it, but there was this incredible vision of them all dancing down the cobbled streets, and the sound of the kind of clanging and clashing of the bells. It was like they were kind of embodying this herd of animals, and it was just a really magnificent thing to witness, really. So again, just a few more images from the series. These are a lot of them do seem quite sinister at first, but these are some local female villagers who are dressed in these very intricate handmade costumes with veils that apparently represent, or supposedly represent, the kind of birth, death, and then the union between 2 individuals. And again, these are all very much handmade, passed down through families, these very thick cloth skirts. That all have different kind of significance and meanings. These guys are actually some of the most kind of famous in terms of these rituals and traditions on the islands, called the Mamutone for Mamoda. And the idea is that they have these incredibly striking, strong kind of profiles. They're wooden masks, and they again carry the cattle bells. And on the actual festivals, they dance around the fires to celebrate the local village saint, which is what a lot of the festivals represent. And they kind of dance through the village, and the bells are apparently there to kind of ward off evil spirits. So there's this very kind of primal, in a way, and almost ancient and atavistic aspect to these traditions, which are all about dressing up and embodying the other, but actually all relate very strongly to this kind of continually evolving, if you like, but also at the same time staying the same traditions of these Italian islands. What was quite different for me with this project is that whereas with Ex Voto, most of the portraits were much more kind of austere, I suppose. For me, this is quite radical experimentation. So, as opposed to just someone kind of staring, or not staring at the camera, engaging with the camera, but in a very direct way, this project allowed for a little bit more experimentation in terms of the images being more performative and theatrical than I have done before. But again, it's very difficult. This one, I cannot tell you the origins of this because there are many contested narratives within these traditions. So, a farmer will say, oh, it's all about the man and the land, and then the kind of nonna in the bakery will say, no, that's not right at all. It's about triumphing over good and evil. So even within these small communities, there is no kind of clear source of where these traditions have come from. But of course, they've remained, also to some extent changed and evolved over the years. So just to end quickly, well, I'll just speak about this image quickly. Again, talking about photography, you don't always know the kind of story behind it. These guys are called Coriolos in Nelly in Sardinia, and they wear, as you can see these huge kind of deer antlers that protrude from their heads, and they again perform a dance around the fire during the actual festivities. But this was I'm just wrapping up now. These are some images I had shown at my gallery Hacklebury in London, where we tried to make it a little more kind of experiential in terms of the experience and played around with larger prints so that they were almost talking to each other in terms of creating this narrative and the story behind some of these rituals. And then that just leads me to the book that was published by Goss recently. Actually, they've got copies you can look at or even buy one here and in the Martin Parr Foundation as well. So do try and have a look at that, because the book contains over 50 images. And it ended up taking about 2.5 years, but the actual photographing was quite small. But I suppose what I was really trying to do was kind of invest myself and embed myself to an extent in these communities. And really, for me, a lot of these costumes, you know, they're really holding on to these traditions and very much trying to preserve them. But it's about the coming together of who we really are. And it's almost like they're saying, we're here and we're alive. And I think that's what, for me, makes these kind of costumes and rituals and traditions so fascinating. I think that's it. Thank you.
Do we have any questions, please?
Fantastic, like mind-blowing images.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, shooting 5:4 obviously it sort of slows you down, and that theatrical element as well. I was sort of thinking, how much direction did you give to the subjects? Like, were they leading it sometimes, or were you doing actually quite a lot to sort of make your image?
I'm just trying to get back. Yeah, it was a mix really. So actually in other projects I've worked on, like I did the project Ex Voto, which contained a lot of portraits, and I was photographing pilgrims in these kind of sacred spaces. And for that, they're much more, on the whole, they were more kind of reserved characters rather. And of course, I was trying to somehow understand their faith, but how do you visualize faith? So that was very different, because with that, I feel I was trying to almost access part of their inner selves. Here, because they're so like they want to show off, you know, they're so proud of these costumes that many of them, like this guy, he's Diavoli, so he's a devil. So that's the stance that's like how he is when he embodies the devil and he's kind of a friendly devil when he wears these costumes. And then some of the others, like the one with the two guys and the where is it, this one, which is quite weird in lots of ways as well. We just kind of played around. It became quite playful. At one point they were like, I thought, because I love those steps and I liked the idea of these steps kind of disappearing into nowhere as well, with how they kind of still standing. But I said, oh, I really love those steps. And immediately one of them came to the top, and then the kind of animal he's in power of lay at the bottom. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. So then I would be like, okay, you've got to stay very still. You've got to be quite patient. But they really almost kind of got into it, because they are embodying these different characters. And I think as a result of that, they really enjoyed the process, and they liked being captured on this big kind of camera, which in a way also mirrored the traditions that they're representing.
I think that's what adds to the magic there.
Right.
So I've seen work before that is kind of similar, and obviously not exactly the same, but you know, they're quite sort of like pose-based and looking right at the camera, not really doing anything.
Yeah.
I think that's what it's
thank you. Yeah, I definitely wanted to encourage that sense of playfulness, because also some of the themes there are quite dark, like death and evil spirits, but at the same time, there's this kind of tension between the light and the dark, if you like. So I really enjoyed that. It became more collaborative, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say, that we were kind of giving each other ideas.
That's great.
As a follow-on to that then, Alys, in terms of whether it was actually in the town or village, or whether it was out in the countryside, how did you make that decision with those particular groups?
So, most of the groups, when I did my research, I photographed them in the villages that they are actually from, where these festivals normally take place. So if it was, they were mostly small villages, but on a couple of occasions they were smaller towns, in which case you would have the pharmacy and the bakery. And obviously I didn't want to show that, well, part of the way I like to photograph, particularly a project like this, is to not show those kind of extraneous signs of modernity. I want you to feel like stuck in another time almost. So with that, I would find the old crumbled stone, or I would find a very quiet kind of alleyway, and I'd say, let's photograph. I would do a little recce beforehand, actually. Yeah, for like.
So with a more modernised village, you take them out.
I wouldn't take them necessarily out of the village, but I would find like an old wall, or I would find, yeah. So I would always kind of have to work with what I had, because we didn't have them for kind of days on end, and I had to be quite quick with how I was thinking. But I also think that my earlier time doing the time out guides for years and years made me gave me the kind of skills that you need to think quite quickly. But then the opposite of that is the actual photographing it's a very slow process. So you kind of make the best with what you have often. Yeah.
We've got a question from our live stream from Leslie, firstly saying, really exquisite and powerful work focusing on land, belonging and rituals. Then asks the question, was anthropology part of your research and preparation? If so, who in particular?
Oh gosh, right. Well, I did actually do an MMA in anthropology about 5 years ago to really enrich and inform my project Ex Voto. So I have got that natural interest in anthropology. I mean, I think for this project, I can't off the top of my head name anthropologists that completely informed the work, but there was definitely the kind of fables and the folklore and the literature. And also I think my background in anthropology that also makes me think very carefully about representation, which is really important, particularly when I'm making work in communities that are current foreign to me or alien to me. So certainly my anthropology background, yeah, it kind of informs how I approach these types of projects.
Any more questions? Oh.
I've got probably actually a quite boring question.
That's okay.
Out of interest, I often see Italy as sort of like a quite colourful, passionate country. Do you exclusively work in black and white?
I have done for my own projects. I have done for the past few years, yeah.
And why was that choice made?
Well, it was really made, first of all, there was practical level, practical reason, which was that black and white film's quite a bit cheaper on 5.4. But I would say more than that, it was that when I first started Ex Voto, which was my big project about pilgrimage, and it was about trying to convey people's deep kind of spiritual beliefs and faith. And I started that was actually a project I started in colour, and it wasn't working at all. Like the pictures for me were very editorial, they were like a nice travelogue, but it didn't encapsulate any of this kind of mystery or tension or stillness that I was trying to express. And when I made the move to black and white with that project, and I made the move to large format, it completely changed the project for me. So it absolutely transformed it. And I remember getting those contact sheets back the first trip I went on with Ex Voto, and I was like, wow, it's finally working. Because there was just this essence of the person coming through that for me hadn't come through in colour. And I'm not saying you can't capture that in colour, of course you can, but for me, a lot of the themes that I'm attempting to kind of explore, and this sense again of being kind of stuck in this almost otherworldly realm, for me, that's better, from my point of view, conveyed in black and white. Yeah.
There's a question far back.
My girlfriend's Sardinian, so she knows a lot about the Amazonas and everything. I went to the festival last year. I was wondering how much, if you know much about, so after, when they go through the streets and everything, first of all, they're all completely hammered.
Yeah, I heard that, yeah.
And so it's all like the young, most of them are all young men in Amazonas.
Yes,
and they all choose, like, they all choose girls that they find attractive, and they all bring them back to like these very secretive house parties that they have.
Okay.
It's like very, yeah, there's a lot of questions on the ethics there. I think my girlfriend got dragged and her dad was like, no. But I was wondering if that's something you had heard of or were interested in.
I would say it's something that I'm, well, I mean, that sounds awful. Like, that's certainly not something I would want to ever promote. And I did hear about these very raucous, them turning into these very kind of raucous events. That's partly why, I mean, they weren't happening anyway, or was there, but that's partly why I photographed them kind of separately. But yes, what was your question? Would I ever want to document that side of things, or how do I feel ethically?
Answered that.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really. I mean, I do. What I would say, and this is not connected to that, it's not to make a direct connection at all, because obviously that's a different. That sounds like women being exploited, and that sounds horrendous. But these are also communities that are deeply patriarchal, still deeply traditional. I still experience, I would say, levels of sexism mapped up. I mean, they were very friendly towards me, but I could see that they were not very progressive liberal communities a lot of the time. So I wouldn't say that doesn't surprise me, but that is an element perhaps of village life that can sometimes, unfortunately, arise. But I don't think that was not what I was trying to. That's not. I wouldn't want to, in any way advocate or promote that side of it. But I have heard that they can get quite out of control sometimes. Those celebrations, if you want to call them that, yeah.
Well, do you want to say?
Yeah. Firstly, yes, thank you so much for making that presentation today. It's really, really good to see that work, and so great to see it selected for the exhibition upstairs. Just a few final notices before we conclude the public talks. Firstly, a very, very, very big thank you to Frederick Aranda, who's a fellow of the RPS and one of our ambassadors, for acting as host during the day. It's a big ask, and you've risen to the challenge extremely well, so thank you.
Thank you.
If you've been inspired by what you've seen today and what you've heard from people like Alys and all the other speakers, then the IPE 165 is now open. It's one of these cycles that we never get to the end of, the RPS, so we've been doing this since 1854. So you can go enter in for the 165. You can find information out at the front desk, and who knows, you might be speaking here this time next year. The other thank yous I'd like to say are, well, actually, I was one other announcement. As part of the exhibition, there's a zine which has been designed by a member of staff here. I think he likes to keep low key, so I won't say who, but thank you to the zine designer. And if you're an exhibitor, there's a copy for you. If you'd like to purchase one, there's a selection outside. They're a limited edition of 300, so get them while you can. And the 163 zines were really popular, so they're outside too. And then the final announcement really is, well, firstly, a big thank you to Billy J, who's been a force of nature, I think, over the past year or so with the call and putting the exhibition together. There's an awful lot of work that goes into it, as I'm sure you would expect, and Billy has risen to the challenge enormously, so please join me in thanking her for getting the exhibition.